So today we're going to have a fun little conversation about my record cabinets. And those of you who know the shop know there's 6 glass-doored cabinets in here that each house about 1,000 records, 10 inches and 12 inches. A lot of jazz history sorted by the labels. And today we're going to compare those 6 cabinets in terms of their content. And I want you guys to ask the question, which door most reflects your current collection? Which door are you most fascinating in diving into? And maybe which door would be your favorite? Any of those questions, if you want to put in the comments or just share how you feel, please do. So the first label I want to take a look at here today in cabinet number 1 is Savoy. There's that J and Kai 10-inch. But the 10 inches are here. Here's the 12,000 sequence, and that rolls along through 12,150 something. Pretty much that's all there. And then at the very tail end here is the Regent section, where there's about 40 titles that Savoy has. Next, we're going to look at Riverside. And there's a cool pressing of Colma Hawkins. But there's early Riverside 10 inches and other Dixieland kind of stuff here. The 200 sequence starts there and rolls all the way through here. So the 300 sequence, and then the 400 sequence will start there. And the rest of Riverside will conclude in the next cabinet. So early Riverside's in this cabinet. The next shelf, we have the Decca 10-inch stuff, LP stuff, the 9200 sequence, Brunswick, Corral, and then Roost finishes out that shelf. All the Roost 10 inches and the Roost LPs. Next, we have the RCA Canon, and there's some 10-inch stuff, and then a bunch of the LPs from the 1000, 1500 sequence. And we get into the later sequence, and then some Vic stuff, which was, of course, also RCA. And then, last but not least, Roulette, which ended up buying Roost and has some great titles. But on the very bottom shelf, we have Columbia, and it's actually the Epic first, Columbia 10 inches. And then we're talking early Columbia 500 sequence into 1000 sequence. So it's all early Columbia down there from the late 40s, early 50s into the mid 50s. So that's door number 1. Do you like that cabinet? Do you have a lot of that cabinet? Cabinet number 2. We start off with Bethlehem. And there's the Bethlehem 10-inch sequence. Here's the Bethlehem BCP sequence. And eventually the Bethlehem 6000 sequence. So pretty much the entire Bethlehem discography is up there. Not very many people have that, I don't think. Now here's the rest of Riverside, the 400 sequence. And then the Jazzland sequence. I mean, the Jazzland stuff has some pretty interesting stuff, including quite a bit of European jazz. And then we're looking at Swingsville from Prestige, right here. Moodsville, right here. And then this is the new jazz stuff, which is Prestige's most experimental stuff. Next, we're going to look at the beginnings of Norman Granz's career. We have the Jazz of the Philharmonic stuff here. We have Clef and Norgren 10-inch LPs and 12-inch LPs. Then we get into the Verve 2000 stuff, the Ella Fitzgerald 4000 stuff, and then we start off with the early Verve 8000 stuff here, which of course will continue in the next cabinet. Next cabinet, we're looking down here at Atlantic, and that's Atlantic 1200, 1300 into early 1400s. There's a lot of good Atlantic titles though in this 200-300 records right there. And then on the bottom, we're looking at more Columbia. Late 50s Columbia. Most of your Miles Davis, your Thelonious Monks, your Charlie Mingus's, your Dave Brubecks, J.J. Johnson's. There's a lot of great stuff here on Columbia. Now we're getting into 70s Columbia down here. And some of the great double LPs from, Miles and Hancock and stuff. That's what that bottom shelf is. So on this next set of doors, cabinet number 3, we have Blue Note 10-inch and then Blue Note 1500 up here. And of course, mostly all the other labels, these are entire sequences. And then we have the Blue Note 4000 sequence right there with early 4100 right there in this cabinet. This cabinet now has the rest of the New Jazz stuff. Prestige 7000 stuff, including some Prestige 10-inch stuff as well. I love the Prestige 7000 sequence. And then that gives way to the Prestige 7100 sequence, which is where the soul, jazz, and a lot of the great blowing sessions at Prestige are happening. The late 50s, early 60s Prestige. The next shelf down would be 8100 Verve, 8200 Verve, 8300 Verve, 8400 Verve, and Verve omits some numbers in their sequences. Most of this stuff here is going to be your Sweets Edisons and Roy Eldridges and Oscar Petersons and Dizzy Gillespie's, and I mean so much great talent. Count Basie, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald got her own sequence. Stan Getz, there's some Woody Herman, Lionel Hampton, Bud Powell. There's so much good stuff here in that era of Verve. And then when you get here, you can see the gatefold start, Creed Taylor starts, and Verve becomes a different, more commercial, appealing, but just like different. Next, we're going to get into the late Atlantic stuff, and we're talking 1400 Atlantic, 1500 Atlantic, and you have stuff like Les McCann and Junior Mance and Rufus Harley, David Fathead Newman, some great stuff. Sergio Mendez, Jack McDuff, Herbie Mann. Next, we're going to get into the ABC launch from the mid to late 50s, sorry. And there's some great stuff in there from Oscar Pettiford and Lucky Thompson, the great Kenny Dorham LP. And then there's the early beginning of Impulse, which of course is launched by ABC. Bottom shelf here is early pre-war compilations from the swing era on labels like Olympic, Folkways, Smithsonian, MCA Heritage. So it's a lot of kind of pre-war comped on LP. And then this next section here is my European jazz labels, and your Steeplechases, your ECMs, Black Lions, Black and Blue, Felsted, Pop, and then we get Phillips. And then we get some kind of 70s labels here, like Pablo, Milestone, Muse, Perception, Concord, Sue, and then Flying Dutchman and Contact are back in there. So that's cabinet number 3. And I think most people have a lot of the Blue Note and Prestige stuff here. Cabinet number 4, I'm going to guess this is what most people's collection looks like. It's 4100, 4200, 4300 Blue Note Tone Poet stuff. So it's Blue Note from 1960, 61 into the late 60s, and then even some 70s Blue Note there, but not a lot. And I know a lot of collectors have that era Blue Note. It's kind of post hardbop. The next section here would be Prestige 7200, Prestige 7300, Prestige 7400, 75, obviously 7600. And so this is later soul jazz Prestige with Miles and Coltrane and Rollins stuff getting reissued. This is actually from 58. So it comes out, gets reissued in 63, but it's not from that vintage. Now we're definitely in the Creed Taylor stronghold era at Verve. all your Stan Getz, Bossa Nova, Austro Gilberto, Cal Tjader, Jimmy Smith, Wes Montgomery. A lot of great stuff in this Creed Taylor era. Verve, Bill Evans has a bunch of stuff, but it is a different beast on some level. But a lot of people have titles from that era. Next would be Impulse. And this is Impulse from probably what, A30 through probably A185 or so. And there's a few titles after that. But a lot of people I know collect Impulse and value the experimental nature of what Impulse had to offer. And the bottom shelf here, that's your CTI Kudu stuff. All that whole box there is pretty much CTI. Beautiful gatefolds, beautiful art. Creed Taylor, again, his last real delve into it. And then this is fusion stuff from the 70s. Your Weather Reports, your Headhunters, George Benson's, you know what I mean, all that kind of stuff, which kind of fits. And so if you take a step back from this cabinet, from these 4 cabinets, if you take a step back from these 4 cabinets, what you actually see unfolding is kind of a chronological timeline of jazz from 1950 all the way through into the 70s. And I mean, that last cabinet is going to be all kind of the tail end of that era. And you get some, you know, but Riverside dies by 62, so it kind of all chronologically makes sense. Savoy's no longer doing jazz by 62. So it all kind of has this chronology to it that folds out as it goes this way. Decca disappears. Columbia's goes from 50s and the 60s and the 70s along the bottom there. All that Columbia stuff, which goes into the CTI stuff and the fusion stuff. So it's a real chronological look at the 4 doors and the era of the 50s and the 60s of the great New York jazz labels. So it's a pretty cool look. And which of those 4 doors is your favorite? Which one of those 4 doors most matches your collection? Which one of those 4 doors are you most interested into diving into and getting to know more about? So now we're going to go look at the Chicago and the New York and the Los Angeles doors. So now this is door number 5. This is pretty much Los Angeles jazz, bass jazz. Again, we're just talking record labels. A lot of these guys came from all over the country. This is the Great Contemporary label, and it rolls all the way to about there. There's about 110 titles or so that I have. Most of the first 100 and a few after that. And then we're going to get into some smaller micro LA labels. The Aladdin family, which includes intro and score. The Andex family, which has some great titles. The Ava label, which is a poppier kind of, but still some interesting jazz stuff. Challenge and Chancellor, which is actually 2 different labels, but they belong together kind of chronologically there. Crown, which was a budget label, but does have some really cool titles. The Design and Dig labels are, again, 2 different labels, but they both only have a few titles. Next is Discovery, which is around 30 10-inch LPs from the early 50s. One of my favorite little discographies. I love Discovery. The Two-Tone label has some great stuff from Dexter Gordon and Carl Perkins and a few cats like that. Curtis Counts. Then G&P Records, they're 10-inch on their 12-inch early LPs. There's some fantastic stuff that Gene Norman is discovering and promoting on the West Coast. So that's some cool LA stuff. Shelf number 2 here, you have Fantasy out of San Francisco. A lot of Cal Tjader, a lot of Dave Brubeck, some cool cha-cha kind of mambo stuff. I like Fantasy a lot, and it's really a fun label. And then we have the Hi-Fi label out of Los Angeles, which has, you know, Something Blue by Paul Horn, some great stuff by Harold Land, Cappy Lewis, a great trumpet player, cool Richie Kamuka, Stan Levy, Bill Holman, some Dixieland stuff. But it kind of ends up becoming the Arthur Lyman label that kind of competes with the Exotica label by Martin Denny, which we'll show you at Liberty. Imperial has some great stuff. Charlie Ventura, some early Charlie Mariano, a lot of Sonny Chris stuff. Some cool stuff. April Stevens, Teach Me Daddy, Teach Me Tiger. Wild Bill Davis, Howard McGee. Jazz West was a fine label that was affiliated with Aladdin, actually. And it's some great titles by some fantastic players. Lou Levy, Gene Fielding, Jack Sheldon. It's just great stuff. I love the Kenny Drew LP, the Paul Chambers LP. There's some good stuff in here. Then we have Motif, which only has a couple titles here. Great Gerald Wiggins. And this is a drummer who, this record gets re-released on Tampa, Max Albright, with a different cover, different name. Here's the great Mode label with all kinds of cool titles and covers. And I love the 30 LPs that Mode does. This is the Nocturne section, about 8 10-inch LPs from the West Coast, obviously LA, that came out in early 50s. It's a fantastic label, and it's hard to collect. The next shelf has Pacific, which we all know, the great Pacific label. Jerry Mulligan, Chet Baker, Chico Hamilton. So many great artists here. Jim Hall, Jack Lidstrom, just some Chet. Bud Shank has a lot of great titles. It's just a really solid label. And then they switched to this sequence, the PJ sequence. And this is kind of soul jazz West Coast style right here. I have almost 200 Pacifics now. Fantastic label that's probably a little underappreciated by the collector today, although Tone Poet is putting some Pacific out. Then we have the specialty label, only 2 or 3 titles on that. Tampa, around 30 titles, great West Coast stuff. Trend, another West Coast label that's obviously, it's good stuff. Vantage, a great little West Coast label with like 3 10-inches, all very rare. Pinky Winters, then that's actually not United, that's actually Tops and a budget label, Tops. Then we have Capitol Records, and as I've talked to you recently, Capitol has an incredible discography of stuff. I have well over 250 Capitols at this point, and including the fantastic late sequence here of 10 inches, the Stan Kenton Presents stuff. Really incredible. And then we get down here with some Latin jazz, Sergio Mendes, Herb Albert kind of stuff. Then there's the Liberty label with Martin Denny, Julie London. It's some good West Coast stuff. United Artists, the film company, and their fantastic sequence of jazz records in the 4,000, 5,000 sequence. And then eventually here in the 14,000 sequence where they do that black and white series of really good jazz titles here. Billy Strayhorn, Herbie Mann, Jerome Richardson. That's really serious stuff. Metro Jazz was an affiliate of MGM, which we see MGM 10 inches there. And then we see the Reprise label, which was launched. The 1,000 sequence is all consecutive Sinatras. The 6,000 sequence was more the Sammy Davises and Dean Martins and that kind of stuff. And then there's Warner Brothers, which really has some early Chico Hamilton and a few things, Antonio Carlos Jobim, but their jazz titles are more significant really in the 70s, much later than most labels. So that is your LA-based labels. And how many of you collect that stuff? How many of you love that stuff? How many of you want that for your collection? And the last one we're going to look at here is the Chicago labels. And we're going to start with the great Emerson Mercury right here. Just an incredible label. A lot of great black blues and soul and R&B, but also a ton of great jazz stuff from Clifford Brown to early Cannonball Adderley. Emerson eventually just gets folded into Mercury. And Mercury, of course, has some legendary stuff, especially a lot of the Quincy Jones stuff. On the bottom here is Argo. And there's the Argo. It has a couple different sequences. The 4,000 sequence is a little bit more bluesy. Etta James. And the 600 sequence and the 700 sequence Argo is fantastic Chicago blues jazz. Just the gospel of the blues and jazz. It's some of the best, cheapest to find. Fantastic major label, but not like nationally distributed label. Argo's fantastic. Next we're going to look at Delmark, a little Chicago label. Then the King Record label out of Cincinnati and Chicago. And then the VJ label. And the VJ label especially has some fantastic titles with Lee Morgan and Wayne Shorter, the MJT3, Wynton Kelly. Some great stuff. King, Eddie Lockjaw Davis, Earl Bostic. I mean, there's some fantastic stuff in here. More Lockjaw, Loras Alexandria. Now we're going to look at some small independent labels in this cabinet. This is the Jubilee label, which has some famous Jackie McLean and Ray Draper and Donald Byrd, G.G. Grice kind of stuff. A little miscellaneous section, which every collection needs. Now we're going to look at some small labels here. These are mostly out of New York, but also Boston, Detroit, a lot of other places as well. Allegro Royale, Audio Fidelity, Candid, Charlie Parker Records, Colpix, Commodore, Cook and Circle Records, the Dawn label, Debut label, DG label, Dial Records, Dot Records, Electra, Esoteric, and Everest. So that's a pretty interesting little shelf of small labels. And then Everest gets continued down here into Jaro, which has about 5 really good jazz titles: Jazz Time, Jazz Line, Jazz Tone, the Cap label, Keynote, a great 40s legendary label, Period, again an early label that was fantastic, Leonard Feather, Progressive, the early 10-inch stuff on Progressive is really hard to find, Stinson, a label that did a lot of cool stuff out of Indiana, if I remember, Indianapolis, and Stinson stuff's tough to find. Here's a little Mary Lou Williams 10-inch. Great stuff. On to Storyville, one of the great Boston labels. George Wein and Company. More Storyville on 12-inch. There's 10-inch and 12-inch Storyville. Time, which was reported by Bob Shad, I believe, in New York. Transition out of Boston, who was formed by, his name is escaping me right now. I know his name, I can't think of it. Urania, fantastic label. And then Vanguard, one of the great kind of forgotten jazz labels as well, with a nice little 10-inch section. So that's the other 2 cabinets. So of these 6 cabinets, which are the most compelling? Which are the ones that most reflect on your collection? So again, it's just a fun look at the different shelves and how they do kind of have a chronology to them. This was all kind of spurred by me looking at that last cabinet over there in the New York labels and going, wow, this looks like most people's collection, at least my own, 20 years ago. The later Impulse, the later Blue Note, the later Prestige, I mean, the Weather Report stuff. I think most people's jazz collections start in that shelf. You know, and then the next shelf over with the earlier Prestige and Blue Notes, that's probably the other one that's really, I think, where most people's interests lie, cabinets 3 and 4. And then cabinets 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 kind of come later, from my estimation. So share with me where your interests are. What's your favorite door of the bunch? If you could pick through one of those cabinets and rate it, which door would you head for? So I hope you enjoyed that. It was just a kind of a fun exercise. And it's interesting to see kind of the chronology of especially the New York labels as it goes from the late 40s into the 50s into those later years of the 60s and even some of the 70s stuff. So it's fun. And, you know, the one upper corner is 40s. The lower bottom corner on the other side of that shelf is 70s stuff. So you can just see it kind of the timeline. It's pretty cool. So yeah, what are you guys interested in? What do you guys like? And we'll talk to you all soon. Peace.